So everybody, thanks so much for listening. We do have Thom Hartmann on. He's been on here many times before, and he does have a new book out called The Hidden Histories of Big Brother in America. And he's syndicated around the country, as you guys should know, from 12 to 3, Monday through Friday, thomhartmann.com, The Hartmann Report on Spotify. Thom, always a pleasure to have you on. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Rob. It's great to see you again.
All right, so let's talk about the book. I mean, you've wrote many hidden history books. What made you want to write this book?
Probably the starting point. I've been just fascinated by this. When my wife was diagnosed with breast cancer 8 years ago, that day she came home from the doctor's office and told me about the diagnosis. And the next morning we went into work, and she shares a computer with a couple of other people. And she logged onto the computer, and suddenly it was throwing ads for wigs and prosthetic breasts and natural remedies for breast cancer at her. And she's like, holy crap, how did this happen? I mean, we talked about it, but and not only that, the ads seemed to follow the computer. So the next person who used that computer was seeing those ads too, and in fact made a joke to Louise about, hey, you shopping for a wig? And having no idea what was going on. I mean, it's just bizarre. And that was, when it kind of first got on my radar screen that, hey, there's something going on here. It's more than just your normal let us look at your purchase history on Amazon and recommend something to you based on that. It's a whole different thing.
I saw the Patriot Act, obviously with the Bush administration, tapping into the phone calls. And like you just said, Google, Facebook, they know every move with that we make. And now we go into, and this is kind of that's where it got started for me. Now I'm worried about, I don't like Alex Jones. I know we both probably don't like Alex Jones. And these people that are conservatives, and they kind of rally these people up and with false hopes and stuff. But my thing is, when we start to censor these people online, I'm worried about, they start with the conservative people, then they're going to start censoring liberal people that they don't agree with. What is your take on that?
Well, first of all, I would say that, Alex and his colleagues, and Alex has been on my show a number of times. He's a bombastic showman, but Alex and his colleagues are not selling hope. There is no, better world that they're promoting. They're not talking about everybody having healthcare or everybody having access to education or even good jobs. They're selling fear, and they're selling fear that's grounded basically in race or in sex, gender identity, things like that. And they're pushing it really, really, really hard. And there's a good chance that they'll have some success with that this fall. But in terms of being censored, I'm not so concerned that, although this has happened, that Google or Facebook would just decide to kick us out. Although Facebook did once terminate my personal account after I had done a rant on the air about them, and it took me months to. In fact, I had to publish an article calling them out for it before they restored my account. And it was just a personal account. I follow about 30 people. They're all members of my family back in Michigan, but it was kind of one of those, we'll get you moves, I'm assuming. I mean, it could have been a mistake, but I don't think so.
I think I'm seeing is, sorry to interrupt, Thom, but what I'm seeing is, I know a lot of people that have pretty big followings on YouTube. They're liberal, progressive, Bernie Sanders guys. And they'll have like 126,000 subscribers on YouTube, and they get like 50 to 100 views a video. And that's very out of step with the viewership and the subscriber list. So that's where I'm kind of getting worried, where these people are calling out Amazon. They're calling out like Hillary back in 2016, Biden when he was running against Bernie. And these people, I feel like, have their thumbs on the scale where, like I said, it might be the Republicans and these Alex Jones, Peter McCullough type people now, but then it's these, all of our liberal friends that are very progressive now also. So it's kind of both ways.
Well, that's where I was going with that answer is the butt that I was just starting to deliver was, I remember back 5-6 years ago when Google decided that they were no longer going to spider a number of websites. One of them was Alternet, and Alternet was like a huge progressive website. And when Google stopped spidering them, stopped putting them in their search results, Alternet fell off the edge of the cliff. I mean, it was a total crisis. This was a nonprofit organization that was doing great stuff, but their business model collapsed. And as a result, the company got sold. The guy who bought it is a good guy. He's doing a great job running it. But, ever since then, it's been kind of limping along. And I get a sense that that's a characteristic that you see with regard to a lot of progressive websites, that have to go through the filter of Google or YouTube, which is owned by Google. Whether that's being applied specifically just to liberals or whether some conservatives are getting whacked like that too, I don't really know.
Sure.
I'm not complaining about it. I'm just noticing it. But you would think, particularly, with the Democrat in the White House, that there would be more progressive stuff on the web. I know, when I'm researching topics for the op-eds that I write every day, for HartmannReport.com, I'll do 20 or 30 searches on different topics, for an article typically. And, I'm constantly finding that as the top 10 hits, 6 or 7 of them will always be conservative websites. And very often in the last 6 months, conservative websites I'd never heard of before. So, there's a clear effort on the part of, the very, very wealthy right-wingers to basically pollute the internet with right-wing propaganda, to fill it, to just slam it with right-wing propaganda. They also pour money into their right-wing stars, as it were. If you're a right-winger and you write a book, you're pretty much guaranteed a slot on the New York Times bestseller list, because they'll do a bulk buy of 10 or 50,000 books and give them away to their members or just pulp them. If you're a right-wing talk show host, even if you're only being paid $40,000, $50,000 a year by your syndicator or your network, which is, pretty much where even people start out, even in the conservative ecosphere. They make sure that, if you give 4 or 5 speeches a year, you get paid $40,000 or $50,000 a speech as a speaking fee. So they've got all these ways to shovel money into their conservative outreach and their conservative systems that literally do not exist on the left. There is nobody funding, hundreds of left-wing websites out there. The left-wing websites that are out there, the old established ones, are having, a real challenge. The Truth Out, Common Dreams, Alternet, the Raw Story, and some of them, like Raw Story, have gone commercial. Just instead of being nonprofit, like Common Dreams and Truth Out. So I am concerned about it. I frankly don't know what we can do about it. It's trying to take on multi-billion-dollar or trillion-dollar corporations, or to expect them to want to highlight messages that might be, hey, it's time to break up the big corporations, is probably a stretch.
Well, Elizabeth Warren ran on, breaking up big tech. That was one of her big platforms in 2020. Yeah. And we do have some progressives in power right now that Joe Biden put in there in that area. So is there a way that this is going to get done? Is it just Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema again that is not going to push this to happen? How can we get some of these things done?
We need to be doing the same thing that Republicans have been doing for the last 8 years in terms of grassroots organizing and building within the party. One of the problems that we have is that America was set up in a way that guarantees a two-party system. With first past the post, winner take all elections. It wasn't until 1861 that John Stuart Mill invented what we call proportional representation, which is how pretty much every other democracy in the world, most of them came about after the American Civil War, and Mill was writing, during the Civil War. And so, most of your democracies now, if a party gets 12% of the vote, they get 12% of the seats in parliament. If they get 35% of the vote, they get 35% of the seats in parliament. Here, we have one party that gets, everything, and the other party that gets nothing. I mean, at the low, election by election. And so that forces a two-party system. And, on the conservative side, they got it, decades ago, that they had to take over the Republican Party. I think this happened after David Koch ran for president on the Libertarian ticket in 1980 and failed. Got just 1 million votes. and they got inside the Republican Party, and they've largely taken it over, and they've brought the grassroots with them. Here on the Democratic side, and I realize some of this is being driven by right-wing propaganda and by Russian troll farms and things like that. But here on the Democratic side, more often than not, if you say something nice about the Democratic Party, you'll get slammed by a bunch of people going, yeah, but it's not pure enough. And my answer is, well, get the hell inside the party and change it. But typically what I get back is, and I'm probably not even talking to a person. It's probably a bot. But this is, Robert Mueller identified this in the Mueller report, that the principal message of the Russian bots, when with targeting information, Paul Manafort gave Konstantin Kilimnik, the Russian spy, he gave him in 2016, gave him all the inside information on the Republican Party, on their polling, on their strategy, on what states they were going to and what states they needed help for. And then, Russian intelligence, Mueller indicted 14 of these guys. Russian intelligence started pushing into those places, into those states, into those to those people that they had identified. This message that the two parties are the same. The Democrats are just as corrupt as the Republicans, so don't even bother voting. The don't even bother voting part they didn't have to say out loud. That's the implicit message, and it worked. In the book, The Hidden History of Big Brother, I document how that message worked really well, particularly, the one example that's in the book, although there's, dozens more that you can point to and that I link to in the end notes, was Wisconsin. Trump won Wisconsin by, as I recall, either 15 or 17,000 votes or 23,000 votes. It was in that neighborhood, relatively small number of votes. And just in Milwaukee, just in one very democratic city with a large Black population, voting, they dropped 60,000 votes over the previous election. And it appears that it was the result of this campaign that was done on Facebook by Cambridge Analytica and by the Russian troll farms. So, in short answer to your question, Rob, what we need to do is get inside the Democratic Party, take that sucker over and flip it progressive. And by the way, a lot of people are doing that. The Progressive Caucus now is the second largest caucus within the Democratic Party. That's a big deal.
I want to get back into the book, but just kind of to say this, I think Bernie would have won Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan.
Absolutely.
I think, I agree with you on the Russian stuff for sure, but it goes back to, we got to have these good, exciting candidates. Barack Obama, exciting, good candidate. He won overwhelmingly both times.
I think Elizabeth Warren could have too.
Right. True. Fact. Yeah, that's right.
Either her or Bernie, either one of them. But, she was literally pulling, 30, 40, 50,000 people at a whack to her rallies. Right. And the national media just went dark on her. They just stopped covering it. They were covering Trump like, oh, look at this. It's a phenomenon. Whoa. If it bleeds, it leads. Yeah, it's crazy. What crazy thing did he say today? But Elizabeth Warren, she had no coverage. None.
And she had a big rally in New York. I remember that. That was, like you said, it was about 30, 40, 50,000, something like that.
It was huge.
Yeah.
And it got no coverage at all.
Right.
And, so, yeah, we've got a problem with our media. There's no doubt about that. And progressives need to employ the work the ref strategy that Lee Atwater fine-tuned back in the 80s for Reagan, and bashing basically media so that they get sensitive about always showing both sides, as it were. And, it's still working for them. And sadly, Eric Boehlert was the guy who was leading that crusade on the Democratic side, and he just died yesterday.
Talking about Florida as being in Florida, that's kind of Big Brother Central. We have the voting laws, transports, don't say gay bill. They had the anti-protesting bill. I know DeSantis calls it Free Florida. Because of the Fauci back and forth, which is all kind of silliness to me. We should be worried about the real issues that people are worried about with healthcare, housing, gas, the list goes on and on. But do you think this is like a real authoritarian state here in Florida? And this is kind of the model, I feel like, for the country, which DeSantis has set in power since, I know he took power in 2019, but he really started this run in 2020 with the coronavirus.
Right. Yeah. My prediction is that DeSantis will be the Republican nominee in 2024, and that there's a better than even chance that he'll be our president.
I agree.
And I would agree with your diagnosis that he's an authoritarian. He's a neo-fascist at the very least. And if he becomes president, it could signal the end of America as we've known it.
But my thing is, and I'm not a Trump guy, but I had a fight with someone about this, is that as a person that's 32 years old, growing up in the Bush era, why are we still, I see Barack Obama and Michelle coddling with George W. Bush because Trump is, mouthing off and being a used car salesman fraud. But no one's talking about what George W. Bush, he was the worst president in my lifetime, not Donald J. Trump, in my opinion.
He lied us into 2 wars.
He lied us into 2 wars.
He stole 2 elections. Of debt. Say what?
He stole 2 elections. He stole Florida, and then all that crap that was, you covered this, in Ohio with Ken Blackwell as Secretary of State, where all those black people couldn't vote, in Cleveland and all over the, all the big cities in Ohio. And no one talks about this. The Patriot Act, 9/11 happened. I think if Al Gore won, it wouldn't have been. That was the beginning of the end of democracy in this country, with George W. Bush stealing that election in Florida with Jeb and Catherine Harris too.
I agree with your analysis 100%. And you're right. I have written about that extensively.
Right. Yeah. But why are people like coddling George W. Bush now? I'm not standing up for Donald J. Trump. Again, he's a used car salesman. He's a fascist authoritarian, like you said, and every other word in the book. But George W. Bush, in my book, is way worse than Donald. Donald J. Trump couldn't touch George W. Bush's toes.
Yeah, no, Bush is a war criminal. I mean, he was responsible for hundreds of thousands of deaths, for millions of people losing their homes, all absolutely unnecessarily. It destabilized the Middle East in a terrible way that is not working for the rest of the world. He set in motion so many things that continue to haunt democracies around the world, particularly in Europe, as a result of refugees coming out of the Middle East. And now you've got a famine that's starting in Afghanistan. I mean, it's one thing after another. And it all goes back to George W. Bush lying to the American people in order to get power. He took, in 1999, he told Nicky Herskowitz, the guy who his family had hired to write his autobiography at Charge to Keep. He told him that if he got a chance to become president, he was going to invade Iraq, and he wasn't going to pull out after 3 days like his daddy did. He was going to stay in Iraq long enough to get himself reelected. And, he kept his word, I guess.
Yeah, it's terrible. And then we're coddling Liz Cheney and Dick Cheney because they're against the insurrection. I mean, Dick Cheney's a war criminal too. And his daughter is just as bad as he is. She's all about war too. I mean, this is crazy. I'm just so upset with the way the Democratic Party is going right now. And they're associating with the Bushes now. I mean, it's just a total joke. I mean, I'm sorry.
Well, there's the insiders and the outsiders, and and this is true in the GOP as well. And the insiders right now in the GOP, the insiders are the Trumpies, the radicals. And the outsiders, although you could argue that's not quite the case in the Senate, but certainly in the House, and because Kevin McCarthy is still sucking up to Trump, like there's no tomorrow. Mitch McConnell's kind of backing away, but in the Democratic Party, the insiders have been the corporate Democrats for basically since the Bill Clinton coup. I mean, Bill Clinton organized this in '92 with him and Al Fromm putting together the Democratic Leadership Council and a corporate takeover of the Democratic Party. And arguably it was absolutely necessary at that point in time because the Supreme Court, had legalized political bribery, and the Republican Party had all these right-wing bringers and giant corporations that wanted them to pass big tax cuts and deregulation. And so the Republican Party had all this money and all this power. And the Democratic Party had always relied on labor unions for their support. And what did Reagan do when he came into office? Let's defund the Democrats. That was his whole strategy. He wasn't going after labor because he hated labor. He used to run a labor union, the Screen Actors Guild. He went after labor because he knew that it was the principal source of revenue for the Democratic Party. And 8 years later, 12 years later, 4 years of Reagan, 8 years of Reagan, 4 years of Bush, and the unionization in the United States has gone from like a third of us down to about 12% of us. It's a 6% now. They gutted the funding for the Democratic Party by doing that. And so Bill Clinton had to look around. Where do I get money? And so he decided, well, we'll get it from corporations just like Republicans do, but we'll stay with the good corporations, the white collar corporations. And so he went for banking and insurance and big pharma and stuff like that, and got in bed with those people. And, the problem that we have right now in the Democratic Party is about half of the party is still in bed with those people. And, the Progressive Caucus is about 100 people. And, they need another 40 or 50 members, frankly, in my opinion. And Bernie and Elizabeth Warren in the Senate need some colleagues, some help. And we're slowly flushing them out. I mean, we got Claire McCaskill out. Well, actually, we didn't. The Republicans did. So she goes to become a TV star with ex-Republicans on MSNBC. But I think that's the work we have to do, Rob. Is we have to get inside the party, become a precinct committee person, volunteer for your local party. The precinct committee people in most states have the first say over who gets to be on the primary ballot, and what the platform is and what the positions of the party officially are going to be. And that's where real change happens. And in most states, anybody can either volunteer to be a precinct committee person, or in some cases you have to run for it. But the cases where you have to run for it, typically it's a paid job. So and where you volunteer is typically not. It varies from state to state. But getting inside the Democratic Party is the most powerful thing that we can do. Rather than just sitting around and complaining about it.
I want to pick your psychotherapist brain if we could, and then we'll move back into the few audience questions for politics. But let's go into this, because talking about the mental health crisis in this country, which not many people are talking about, and also the long COVID crisis in our country, the Senate just punted the COVID aid, which would help a lot of the vaccine distribution, a lot of this healthcare issues. Yeah, so it's really terrible. It seems like the Obama administration over again, we're fighting back and forth with the Republicans. But there's a lot of people suffering right now from these issues. Like I said, long COVID and mental health in general, because of lockdowns, because they're scared to get COVID, the masks and stuff like that. And what I've heard from, therapists that I've interviewed and psychiatrists that I've interviewed is that there's a lot of pushing of these SSRIs and the SNRIs too. And I'm worried about this is like the next opioid crisis, that they're just trying to push all these drugs on people. And a lot of these people may not need it. Some may, but it's going to be a problem. What do you think about that?
I agree with you. And with that analysis, in the 60s, when I was a kid growing up, it was Valium. And they were referred to as Mother's Little Helper. In fact, it appears in a Beatles song and it appears in a Jefferson Airplane song from the 60s. And all these housewives were taking Valium. And, I knew several of them. And then, people started abusing Quaaludes and things. And finally, they discovered that these women were, mostly housewives, were getting addicted to the Valium. And it was a year or two of kind of flushing that out. And then we saw the same thing with the opioids, where the Sackler family came out and promoted this stuff like crazy to doctors, and doctors started passing them out. The SSRIs, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, actually change the receptor. Serotonin is a neurochemical that our body uses to, you could call it a mood regulator for lack of, right. But it's really complex. It does a lot of different things, but in terms of mood, it's a mood regulator. And for all practical purposes. And when you down regulate the ability of the brain to receive it, to notice that it's there, you get a change in behavior. But over time, what happens is the brain just starts producing new receptors. The same problem with the opioids. And so, you get this addiction kind of syndrome, and people trying to withdraw from these SSRI drugs have symptoms that, in my opinion, and having actually seen it with a family member, are harder than withdrawing from heroin or withdrawing from narcotics.
Wow.
You get these electric shocks in your brain and wild depression and just insane stuff. But they haven't yet been categorized as addictive drugs. I think, frankly, they should be. And it's going to take the FDA doing something about it. But I'm guessing you're right that during the lockdown, all the anxiety associated with that has probably radically increased the number of scripts that are being written for these drugs. And the other thing is, and it's been a while since anybody's talking about this. Peter Breggin really championed this, and I realize he's considered kind of a fringe figure, but he's a psychiatrist and he's written several books on it. Is that all these school shooters who were on SSRI drugs, Prozac is the most famous of them. It was the first. And, the question is, does it dampen affect? Does it dampen it to the point, our ability to relate to other people, to the point that it's basically creating sociopaths? It's creating people who can't empathize with other people. Their emotions are dulled, and the mechanism by which their emotions are dulled, so they don't have the lows anymore, that mechanism is also the mechanism by which we experience the emotions of other people around us, which is something called empathy. And when you dial down empathy, what you're doing basically is dialing up sociopathy. And so, these school shooters are not seeing their fellow students as human beings, they're seeing them as objects. And I think that's another very dangerous aspect to the use of SSRIs, frankly. Now, that said, there are some people who are, experiencing severe clinical depression, or other symptoms or other conditions for which they're, severe obsessive compulsive disorder, for which there is no easy cure. And, through psychology or even through pharmacology, and some of those folks benefit tremendously from SSRI drugs. But that's probably a tiny slice, maybe 3, 4, or 5% of the total number of people who are getting these drugs prescribed to them. Just like there are people who have such severe chronic pain that they need to be on opioids probably for the rest of their lives. And I suspect the day of reckoning is coming.
And the benzodiazepines too is
that's Valium. Too. Valium was the first of the benzo drugs.
It's crazy. I just want to combine some of these together to be gracious with your time. So, 2022 is coming up. As far as that goes, it seems like it's a Democratic wipeout. Unfortunately, I'm hoping that it's not going to be, but it seems like it is. But the thing that gets me, and this is what I want to get your opinion on, is we have Manchin and Sinema. They're holding up all these good laws, Build Back Better, and everything else in the kitchen sink. Joe Biden was supposed to be the FDR, Democrat. He said that he was going to be like a guy that knew the Senate. That was his talking points, that he had been in the Senate for so long, he could negotiate with Republicans. Now, to say that, there's a lot of those Republicans he was negotiating with are gone. They're out of the Senate. But besides the point, my thing is, I think of Joe Biden, I did think of Joe Biden like an LBJ guy for Obama. He could go into the Senate and kind of shake it up, talk to these guys.
And he did. He helped push through the Affordable Care Act.
But he's not doing that as president of the United States. LBJ.
Oh, no, he tried. The problem is that Kristen Sinema is taking millions of dollars from big pharma, and Joe Manchin is making millions of dollars off his private little coal company and a corrupt little deal with this one particular power plant that the New York Times just outed. These people are on the take. And it's a shame. I mean, they're behaving like Republicans.
But is there any hope for the Democrats to get anything?
If we can pick up 2 more seats.
Well, John Fetterman, I think, is a chance.
I think so, yeah. And
if Connor Lamb doesn't screw him, then I think he can beat a Republican.
I think there's a shot in Ohio. I think that there's a couple states we might pick up. We'll see. All
right. Last question. 2024, I got to ask you, is it going to be Biden? Is it going to be Harris, Clinton, Buttigieg, maybe a progressive? What do you think?
I have no idea. And at this point in time, it's just...
Yeah, it's too early, but these people are all thinking.
What I would like to see, I would like to see Elizabeth Warren in that mix.
I agree.
And I would like to see a much higher profile right now for Kamala Harris, because if she is going to be, the inheritor of the throne, which is typically how it works, Hubert Humphrey after LBJ, for example, she has to be strengthened tremendously. Her public profile is pretty much non-existent, and that needs to change because, Joe Biden's 78 years old. She could be taking over at any moment, and God forbid, but it's the simple reality. So those that, and the Democratic Party, there's a lot of jockeying for power right now. The other big one is who's going to replace Dianne Feinstein in the Senate. She's like in her mid 80s, and it seems to be kind of starting to lose it. So I don't know. We'll see. I would love to see a progressive, and I think that if there ever was a time for a good progressive, of Bernie Sanders, although I think Bernie is probably done with running for president. Elizabeth Warren, though, she's in her 60s. She's young enough. She's got incredible vitality. She's one of the best progressives out there. I don't know if Sheldon Whitehouse has a stomach for presidential politics, but he is an extraordinary guy. There's a lot of talent in the Democratic Party.
I'm originally from Rhode Island. Sheldon's a good man. I met him. I campaigned for him in 2006 when he beat Lincoln Chafee. And I met Lincoln Chafee. I had him on here. He's a great guy too. I mean, he kind of changed. It's a different kind of Republican where he was,
Well, he came from the era when Republicans were not insane.
Right. Yeah, and he actually supported Bernie in 2016. So I got to give him credit for that. So where can people get the book, Thom, and learn more about you in general?
You can get The Hidden History of Big Brother any bookstore anywhere in the country, and you can follow my daily writings over at hartmannreport.com.
hartmannreport.com, thomhartmann.com. Thom, thanks so much for your time. Greatly appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me again, Rob. It's great.